With the rise of AI, the unforeseeable ways this technology will alter our daily lives, culture and lifestyles are still being developed. Already it has torn through 2D art in unpredicted ways. It now makes music and it's improving in video rather quickly as well. This technology is now affecting intellectual labor too, with its capacity to do several analytical tasks such as answer questions using an encyclopedia, generate essays, do journalism and, in short, automate many of the kinds of research and analysis which require academic training. We have yet to see or reliably predict how much it will be able to do academic work itself, like writing academic journal research, but certainly it is already a tool for academic work. I, for one, was motivated to make this video because I write these video essays with the aid of AI to help me edit and voice them. AI also generates much of the video and music used in them, helping me avoid copyright concerns. This allows me to write essays and present them in a medium which is far more accessible to a wider audience than the essay alone might be. There are also many advantages to this format when thinking through ideas for me, expressing them and getting feedback on them. For instance, instead of citing sources in a footnote, I can screenshot the source, which is actually much easier than putting a citation in the formal MLA format in an essay. But it also allows me to cite more than just written sources. I can edit in videos or audio. I can even cite the original source's audio in the original language with a subtitle underneath. Then there is the aspects of the process of formulating my arguments. I can think in pictures and words when writing and use both to make my arguments. This alone allows many different kinds of thinking and thinkers to get more traction with their ideas than they would if they had to formulate all their ideas into written words alone. Helping those people who think more heavily in images and helping an audience who understands better through the use of images. It is easier for both speaker and listeners who have a high spatial IQ to communicate with images, and this may even have greater race and ethnicity inclusion as a result, given how certain populations have better spatial IQ than they do linguistic intelligence. It can also help those with high logical and mathematical intelligence to see the logical operation in a written image and ideas drawn out in diagrams. Models and diagrams are also easier to hold in the mind than the attention needed to understand the same information without a diagram. Science has always used visual models for modeling its theories, and we don't teach kids the solar system with descriptions. We use a model. There is no reason we should force a process of putting everything into words when communicating knowledge, if maybe it's better communicated through visual models. Simple drawings, diagrams, and animations have a pedagogical value, and everyone enjoys the beloved meme. The role of the teacher, after all, is to make things as clear as possible to the student. The video format offers a plethora of ways to crystallize ideas visually. AI for content creation is also helpful in the thinking process. It can be used to refresh old knowledge before writing on it and provide summaries to fact-check arguments. It's also an easy way for the listener to fact-check information, and one could simultaneously listen to a lecture with ChatGPT open and gain supplemental information about what they are listening to. This medium is changing how messages can be formulated, produced, expressed, and accessed in very interesting ways. This lowers the bar of entry to creating essays, which means people with no formal training in critical thought can start entering into the process of critical thinking by putting their ideas down in writing with little knowledge of grammar or typing. AI allows one to dictate to a transcriber, get your ideas down, and have an AI grammar checker fix your errors, even have ChatGPT respond to them. They can then try and organize their writing into stronger arguments and find a public to give them feedback. Of course, it's up to them to do this as a practice in critical thinking, to intentionally work through their own ideas and avoid the flagrant pitfalls which plague social media, where these same technologies do just the opposite and help the user indulge in brain rot, like Reddit posters or Twitter zealots, who write with no thought to what they're saying to groups of echo chambers and bots who applaud them for saying some platitude or ideological trope that fulfills an emotional need. Regardless, I'm trying to look at the potential and remain optimistic. This new medium for writing down, organizing and presenting ideas has been combined with the prevalence of distribution of those ideas through online streaming videos and podcasts, which has a new potential for knowledge creation that is both promising and disruptive. There are effects downstream from all this that are unforeseeable with the use of AI-analyzed information, and layman distribution of knowledge, where we may be silently moving toward an epistemological crisis regarding how education is perpetuated. A crisis of the university system. Now making educational content has become exponentially easier, and anyone with a cell phone and internet access can create and access videos. A plumber can change his status to a full-time teacher with an online channel giving away decades of acquired experience and knowledge to anyone looking to install a toilet or refurnish their bathroom. Likewise, grad students can teach online without having any affiliation with a university and get paid through Patreon, rather than work as adjuncts with no job security or significant income. Material constraints such as location, access to a library, or limited number of seats in a classroom are no longer a factor. There is less than ever a need to hire a facility or administrators to set up schedules and semesters of time allocation for a professor's presence, or deal with many of the other physical constraints which come from a brick-and-mortar education such as social class, identity, and status. Today, a jailed criminal can watch an MIT professor. Today, quality, tested, hard-gained knowledge has a market value, which even if not accredited may still be judged valuable by market forces, and so has become a market commodity, a commodity which is not exclusive to professors and universities to confer value on and have exclusive jurisdiction over. Not only can anyone almost anywhere learn, anyone with ChatGPT can conceivably put together lesson plans, have a YouTube channel, and just read a ready-made curriculum written by AI as though they were a formally trained teacher on the subject. Although they are not an accredited teacher, the information they use may be solid. They conceivably could seek out an accredited teacher who could be paid as a consultant. Furthermore, a corporate entity could scale this process to check over rather than create or teach information, pushing trained academics into something like knowledge editors or notarizing agents for corporate for-profit education projects. Where it is profitable enough to do so, we should expect corporate power to lobby the accreditation process, deregulating it so that AI can be fused with corporate efficiency. The other condition which has changed is leisure. Education has also always demanded a prolonged period of consistent leisure time. This too is no longer the limiting factor for who can be educated and who cannot. Even if someone is working a 40 or 60-hour week, they are now more than ever able to expend what energy they do have on intellectual pursuits simply by going onto YouTube and finding a professor talking on a subject that interests them. An immigrant plumber can just as well spend his days fixing toilets while listening to a recorded class semester on the subject of 16th century European history that interests him. The same class is given by the same professor that a bored, blue-blood privileged white male is sitting in and playing video games while listening to. A new market for hobbyist education is one podcasting has capitalized on and is evident in its explosion of popularity, where every niche interest has a group of knowledge peddlers competing for attention, often of the blue-collar worker who has their headphones in while they do their 9 to 5. This in alone is not significant enough of a threat to the university to bring about its end, but enough that it will need to continue to adapt to an environment with new types of teachers and ways of teaching entering its ecosystem. But at the same time, there is another epistemological crisis going on within the university, one very much antagonized by the university itself. That is the spread and application of deconstructionism to every academic discipline. First, to define the term deconstruction, Britannica describes deconstructionism as the following.
In popular usage, the term has come to mean a critical dismantling of tradition and traditional modes of thought. The oppositions challenged by deconstruction, which have been inherent in Western philosophy since the time of the ancient Greeks, are characteristically binary and hierarchical, involving a pair of terms in which one member of the pair is assumed to be primary or fundamental, the other secondary or derivative. Examples include nature and culture, speech and writing, mind and body, presence and absence, inside and outside, literal and metaphorical, intelligible and sensible, and form and meaning, among many others. To deconstruct an opposition is to explore the tensions and contradictions between the hierarchical ordering assumed and sometimes explicitly asserted in the text and other aspects of the text's meaning, especially those that are indirect or implicit or that rely on figurative or performative uses of language. Through this analysis, the opposition is shown to be a product or construction of the text, rather than something given independently of it.
To help unpack this better for the layman, Deconstruction deals with meaning in the text. It was born as a method in literature analysis, trying to understand a text's meaning. This is part of hermeneutics, which deals with interpretations of texts. Since there are obviously better and worse interpretations of a text, we need ways to evaluate that. Your stoner friend, for example, who reads the Bible after hitting the bong and explains to you how Moses was doing drugs, that's what the burning bush means, and that aliens are in Ezekiel is one interpretation of the text. And as silly as this example is, it captures exactly why something as dry and esoteric as literary theory can have a huge impact. The meaning of holy books has a huge influence over people's lives, and theologians have spent centuries doing hermeneutics. Apart from that, for people who don't care about what holy books say, the problem of interpretations and meaning still affects your life. The Constitution, for example, how should we understand and direct legislation according to the Second Amendment or the 14th? This job of interpretation belongs to the Supreme Court, which shows how impacting and how much power an interpretation of text can have. Further, if we can have a clearer understanding of a text, then perhaps the same methods used to do so will help us understand the meaning of events in society more accurately. Since culture is collectively always interpreting events, shaming some and praising others, thus exerting power over other people's behaviors and conferring the meaning on those behaviors. In short, a niche discipline of the English department, literary theory of all things, ends up having a lot of applications in understanding and governing social behavior, either through the interpretation of law or by promoting one interpretation of behavior through the socialization of it, until its meaning is interiorized as a social norm. Let's look then at the key ways deconstruction is used in text analysis, then see in more detail how these tools are used to do critical theory. First, by examining binary oppositions, deconstruction challenges the idea of binary oppositions. For example, good-evil, male-female, nature-culture. In classical thought, one term in each pair is often privileged over the other. Derrida, the founder of Deconstructionism, argues that these binaries are not natural or fixed, but rather constructed and hierarchical. His method seeks to dismantle these hierarchies by showing how the meanings of these oppositions are dependent on each other and how the superior term relies on the inferior one for its definition. Second, through difference. Another key concept in deconstruction is difference. Is a term coined by Derrida to describe the process by which meaning is endlessly deferred in language. The meaning of a word is not fixed, but depends on its relation to other words, which in turn refer to other words, creating an infinite chain of signification. Difference also suggests that meaning is produced through difference. Words and concepts gain meaning through their differences from other words and concepts. Third, by textual instability. Deconstruction views texts as inherently unstable and open to multiple interpretations. Instead of seeking a single, definitive meaning of a text, deconstruction emphasizes the fluidity of meaning and the ways in which texts can contradict themselves. The method reveals the internal tensions and contradictions in a text, showing that what appears to be a clear, coherent meaning is often undermined by the text itself. Fourth, by undecidability. Deconstruction often leads to the concept of undecidability, where a text resists clear interpretation and cannot be easily pinned down to a single definitive meaning. This challenges the traditional view that texts have a stable central meaning that can be uncovered by careful analysis. Finally, deconstruction's method reads against the grain. Deconstructive reading involves looking for how a text subverts or undermines its own stated intentions or meanings. This might involve focusing on what is left unsaid, contradictions, ambiguities, or marginal elements of the text that destabilize its apparent coherence. Now, what I think this boils down to for our purposes is that deconstructionism is a form of literary criticism whose methods showed promising application to other disciplines and eventually entered into politics as a method for social criticism where it is prevalent today. However, it is inherently suspicious, and born from that suspicion is a fixation on power when it is applied to social criticism, where it emphasizes that concepts are constructed by dominant power groups. This they do by creating binaries. This binary is a special kind of binary, one unique to the conceptual paradigm of Western thought. It is an asymmetrical binary, having one part of the binary artificially granted an uncriticizable status as privileged, primary, or fundamental, thus making the other secondary or derivative. This is where its use as a method of analysis begins to deconstruct in the pejorative sense. It looks at Western culture and history and sees implicit privilege of one aspect of a binary, for example, man, as the source of oppression over women. Let's look in more detail at the binary of nature and culture. First, if we take nature as a concept, it's not understood as a concept by the power group that formulates it and who thus has power over it by formulating that concept. Like a jar holding some content, the jar organizes the content but shares nothing with the content. It is not the content, yet has power over the content. Culture is a jar which defines what nature is. So there is a cause and effect present here. A culture formulates a concept of nature, and so causes it as a means to talk about something which is binary to itself, which is its opposite. Yet in history, that is not an accurate cause and effect. Culture came second. There was a pre-culture state which was nature, but nature had no concept of itself until culture came to exist. Culture othered nature as something different from itself. The concept of nature is determined by the culture. A culture must come before the concept of nature, and the concept nature is formulated by that culture. So our understanding of nature is always deficient because it has always been othered. It was forced into submission to and processed by a culture's bias of what nature is. Nature's identity is the identity culture gives it. It's unfree to determine its own identity, and so the concept has been pre-processed with whatever limits culture has projected into its formulation. For instance, men in the West feel a need to dominate nature, and so will understand nature from the viewpoint of a male's relation to it rather than a feminine one. While those who are in that culture uncritically are unconscious of this and believe their concept of nature to be an accurate understanding of nature, but since they are unconscious of this, they can't see the bias built into it. Deconstructionists would deconstruct the concept of nature and explore the limits imposed on the concept of nature and how those limits are determined by the limits of the culture which formulated it. The problem arises with knowing when our concepts might by chance be accurate. Is all of our thinking unconsciously poisoned by this, a prior category of oppressing when using concepts? Let us use light as an example. Darkness doesn't exist. Darkness is an absence of light, so a shadow is derivative from the absence of light. The non-being status of shadows means it is inferior to light, since a shadow cannot exist independently of light. This then creates a hierarchy. But does that make it false? The shadow is inferior and light privileged. It involves hierarchies. Does this promote social inequality and oppression by proximity? After all, this grants greater importance to one binary over the other, making one necessary and the other contingent, so that science itself becomes suspect. Science, if it has hierarchies and inequalities, if it has necessary and contingent binaries, could possibly be little more than a word game concealing an asymmetrical power dynamic and employing insidious conceptual tricks to legitimize hierarchies in society. This could all be part of a heterosexual white male way of dominating others. If by saying hierarchies and inequalities are scientific and part of nature, does that not also say that Western power over other groups is part of nature? We can see too how this is used in feminism to explain oppression. In Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, the social concept of woman is always a derivative of man. She makes painstaking efforts in the first chapter to analyze the animal kingdom and how the males and females behave, reproduce, and look at the biology of gender. She did this in 1959, almost a half-century before this debate became at the center of our culture. She examines the historical way woman is a concept generated for the legitimization of oppression of one group, a group who has no ethnicity, no religion, and so no identity in a male-determined legal system. Thus, turning women only into sex as an identity, into an object and another with no subjectivity, it does this by giving precedence to the concept of man and making women a second sex. What's also interesting was she had done this 10 years before deconstruction had begun. The problem with these analyses is how they confront the ontological status of reality. That is, if reality does have hierarchies, inequalities, and derivatives, the way shadows are derivatives from a more primary element, light. How can we prevent that scientific fact from being used to justify social hierarchies of oppression? What's important to deconstructionists is how this has been used to create dominance and inequality by employing those concepts in social relations, where the privileged claim such hierarchies to be in the metaphysical structure of reality, and so legitimize their privilege. If all of these are just tools for domination, the project of critical theory is that thinks it is necessary to challenge every binary down to the cellular level. This was not Derrida's original program. He didn't even deal with politics till later in his life. He was primarily interested in language, and this is what deconstruction was before it morphed into a tool of critical theory. Originally, Derrida was following Saussure's efforts in analyzing the signifier and the signified, that is, the audible word and the mental concept, and to explain the importance of syntax to understand the meaning of a word. For example, without a sentence, the word bank in English can mean a riverside or a place to hold money. It's only its relation to other words that its meaning can be found. All of this is very useful for epistemology and helps us better analyze how our minds know reality. So we should not simply dispense with deconstructionism as destructive. It, like skepticism, is a means to new insights, but it can also blind if misused. Still, these methods of linguistic analysis have been ardently picked up by critical theorists and by those who see no ordered metaphysical reality and synthesized with their own philosophies. Due to the relativism of meaning deconstructionism can facilitate, it is very attractive to those who believe that there is no ordered metaphysical reality. Those who do not see our ontological situation to have an underlying hidden logic, like the laws of physics, biology, and math that our minds can know, discover through the scientific method and must conform to acquire truth, who instead believe all reality is a valueless grey goo upon which order is imposed by the mind. For that position, deconstructionism is a very compatible tool, one for deconstructing everything into that valueless grey goo they believe is our ontological reality, and for delegitimizing any social concept like woman, nature, good and evil. So what begins as a language issue on how we use language to know the world turns into an ethical problem: who should impose order on a chaotic, immoral world? Whoever they are, they must do so with some new ethical system. Otherwise, the orders they create will fall into the same problems of those they have deconstructed and become oppressive systems of dominance that use language to manipulate and dominate others, pretending it to be from some higher ordering. Or maybe that is all there is, just competing systems of oppression, redressing language with new clothing to justify oppression with ethical language, to hide that they are among us. That's at least what Friedrich Nietzsche thought. This process of rebooting our conceptual world by deconstructing it has been happening much the same way that skepticism did. During the age of Descartes, skepticism had torn through the philosophical and religious mind of the 18th century zeitgeist. The certainty in an objective, metaphysical and moral order which could be known by the mind had undergone a similar erasure. In a certain sense, we are repeating this pattern. Then skepticism had led Western epistemology to conclude that only the scientific method can give us true and certain knowledge about anything, that which it could not demonstrate, such as metaphysics and a moral order, were not real forms of knowledge. Men like Voltaire and Descartes thrived in this environment. The French Enlightenment forced the West to rebuild all knowledge and all claims of truth on the empirical method. To do this, it relied on the reduction of knowledge to mathematical reasoning, following Descartes' method, which had 4 steps by which all knowledge generation would start with. First, by accepting nothing as true that is not self-evident, mathematical conclusions being self-evident to anyone calculating them. Second, by dividing problems into their simplest parts. Third, by solving problems by proceeding from simple to complex. And fourth, by rechecking the reasoning. This methodology has been applied to all of the material sciences, developing into a more robust and sophisticated empirical method, but was limited to empirical objects which could be measured by mathematics, that is, objects of knowledge, which are themselves material. If the skepticism of Descartes suffers from anything, it's this reductionism. The only objects it can look at are the objects which can be quantified. If they cannot be quantified, then skepticism will end in cynicism. The methodology cannot be applied and therefore cannot generate real knowledge of phenomena which is not mathematical. This means we cannot talk about love using exclusively the hard empirical sciences. To do so, you must first pre-process it into a mathematical substance. We run love through a meat grinder and turn it into a hamburger of biological constitutes that we then reconstitute into models of chemical reactions, evolutionary incentives, and neurological patterns. We must pre-process it into measurable elements, not accepted as it seems to be, which at the end of the day is not the phenomena of love that most people would recognize, but rather some Frankenstein reconstitution of flesh, which the material sciences obligate us to identify as a more accurate model of love than the poet would tell us love is. Thus ending in cynicism about the nature of love at best, unless we choose to think that empirical models only explain some of the layers but doesn't give the full picture. The reconstituted Frankenstein of love, meanwhile, is a sufficient enough justification for all kinds of nihilistic sexual liberality, the kind men like de Sade live for, where liberality comes at the cost of sex being another meaningless act in our meaningless lives, since the empirical method cannot give life meaning either. So perhaps the poets may be worth entertaining, or at least reading when they explain love and the soul. So many things which are known to us and experienced by us have to be diminished in their status of knowledge until such time arises that they can be empirically explained or pre-processed into a quantifiable state. Using economics as another example, we pre-process what happens in economics according to measurable data. We can understand supply and demand using numbers, and we use a mathematical language for looking at resource exchange. We can look at the effects of supply and demand, the numbers of things produced and sold, yet we can't look at the psychology of the buyer, and we can't use economics to build exactly what every person wants, since those are not quantifiable variables. To do so has been the project of controlled economies, which try to account for all economic variables and control human behavior like any other material object governed by the laws of physics. Economics is more than numbers. It's an anthropological theory of what humans are, and an analysis of human action. Those economies that think of man as nothing but a quantifiable organism tend to end in blasé meaninglessness, which is stifled in any vitality of cultural production. The market economy, for all its failures, has had the presence of mind to try and account for man having a will, reason, and irrational appetites, usually just to try and coerce rather than control them. But this presence of mind has allowed the unknowable and unmeasurable variables which can't be mathematically reduced to act themselves out. So like skepticism and mathematical reductionism, deconstructionism, for all of its ability to give us new interpretations, comes so at a cost. Namely that it, like Marx and Freud, was born of suspicion, and with that a cynicism which becomes baked into anything it's used for. So that ethnicity, race and gender, which were all considered to have immutable substrates within them, have all been deconstructed, reduced to this grey goo with no objective content to them, and which can be molded and manipulated by the needs of this new moral system, limited only by the limits of technology. Gender identity and the trans movement push this worldview the most explicitly, where the body has no eternal substrate, but is only social constructs which determine it. This brings us to a third epistemological crisis happening in academia, which deconstruction has facilitated: the ability to circumvent critical analysis, scientific methods, the replication of experiments, and peer review in the promotion of theories. First, let's look at the replication crisis in psychology. In 2015, Nature published an article on Brian Nosek, a social psychologist who examined 269 original papers from 3 psychology journals and found over half to be unreplicatable. Only 39 of the 100 replication attempts were successful. Since then, this has continued to be a problem within psychology referred to as the replication crisis, which has been followed up with further studies noting that this is heavily influenced by papers using experimental methods and papers using non-experimental methods. Given that psychology is a soft science, meaning it's theoretical and clinical, not all its methods of doing research use experimental methods. Next, let's turn to gender theory and cultural studies. These disciplines have very weak testability, relying primarily on lived experience, that is to say, anecdotal evidence, the lowest form of scientific data, which is also not replicated in any controlled way. If one takes a social survey about their feelings, it tells us very little except how one person was feeling at one moment in time. Psychology, meanwhile, has been able to model gender dysphoria, while human biology established non-typical forms of biological, genetic conditions and reproductive expression. This is data that gender theory has been able to lean on in the construction of its model of human sexuality, but none of it has come from gender studies methods. It has come from other sciences using the empirical method. Gender theory's model of human sexuality is primarily based on using a method, creating doubt about the existence of genders through the deconstruction of them, which is not the same as providing a testable, evidence-based, falsifiable model of human sexuality. This radical skepticism of proving something isn't there is not the same as proving its absence is by default the only thing that's there. Much like the God of the gaps, the method of trying to prove God's existence by how science can't disprove it, or as the explanation to fill in the gaps of accepted scientific theories. Gender theory deconstructs gender and then demands privilege status to its theory to fill the vacuum it created, that is, gender as a social construct. However, all it establishes is that gender may be more metaphysical than biological. This is what their claim is, that social constructs are metaphysical forms, that is, immaterial constructs which structure and order the material or physical. Why are we to prefer this metaphysical claim over any other metaphysical theory of gender? Nor does this absence of biological gender mean a social construct of gender is correct. It too can be doubted and deconstructed by their own methods. It too can just be the creation of a society. There's no reason to believe it speaks of anything outside of the society that gender theory was constructed within. Gender theory is itself the creation of Western culture, and so prone to be just as polluted by all the oppressive domination and power relations found in Western thinking. In short, by deconstructionists' own method of critical analysis, gender theory is suspect of being a tool for oppression too. After all, nothing is more a social construct than the theory of social constructs, a theory constructed and coined by a limited cultural situation in history and containing all the bias of that culture's material conditions. Being unable to sustain their claims through the use of scientific methods, they circumvent them by burying the evidence for their theories in this God of the gaps method, appealing to the outliners in genetics, the statistics of anecdotal evidence and the loose ends of biological models to punch holes in other theories and insist these holes prove their metaphysical theory. They also have the right to present their theories as explanatory when alternatives are not available, as would any theory. Flat earthers have every right to do so too, yet gender theory is engaging in metaphysics. It is talking outside its own discipline when suggesting this is a condition of nature, rather than just a critic of social norms. They redefine nature by examining the places in the animal kingdom where gender is ambiguous or unconventional, such as murex, frogs and plants, which can manifest gender fluidity. They extrapolate that data and then apply that condition to human gender. Interpreting subjective human experiences about how one feels about their gender from anecdotal evidence with empirical data coming from non-human biology. Something which happens in one science, zoology, is applied to another science, human biology, without appeal to the principles of human biology or its methodologies. The empirical method nor empirical data about human biology are used to establish their conclusion. That is to say, one does not need to prove gender fluidity through empirical evidence in human biology or by using material data from that species like genetics or the cell formation of gametes. Nor do these theories need to pass muster in peer-reviewed journals by other biologists and be tested for the reproduction of results, because there are no tests nor any results to verify. One can instead circumvent this process of experimentation, verification and replication by deconstructing gender in zoology, then by deconstructing a taxonomy of the animal kingdom so that human sexuality and murex sexuality can then be conflated to being made up of the same unlaying genderless nature, thus constructing a theory of nature, but one based on anecdotal evidence, most coming from people with dysphoria about their own bodies. But assuming this is not a problem, why do we stop deconstructing social constructs at this point and not continue to deconstruct the gender theories, concepts of a genderless nature? Can't it itself be treated as a product of a culture trying to dominate nature by removing any gender from it? What gender theory gives us is a metaphysics of social constructionism, which has a genderless nature as its prime matter, and where the form of gender is given to the genderless matter of nature rather than derived from it. But this is all metaphysics, not biology. So why isn't it being dealt with as metaphysics? From what I can see, it's because this model of metaphysics circumvents any philosophical analysis. By denying it is a metaphysical model, since it denies there is even such a thing as metaphysics to model. By doing this, it disavows any philosophical jurisdiction over its metaphysics and thus begs special privilege to not engage with philosophy as a philosophy or admit any philosophical engagement with ontology. While deconstructionism is a literary theory and thus an unempirical discipline, merely using their jargon effectively can grant a thinker publication in their academic journals. This can then be used to give a pretense of scientific legitimacy to their claims to the public. The lay public often sees all professors in science as monolithic and only understands that some published professor is saying a theory is legit. They do not understand the minutiae in these debates or the levels of consensus on a theory. A gender studies professor is conflated in the layperson's mind as speaking on behalf of science, even though their discipline does not use the scientific method. And by using deconstructionist academic journals to publish their research, they can also use that prestige to give weight to their theories when promoting them in public discourse and legal policy. Such theories can metastasize insulated from any true critical analysis by the hard sciences or from metaphysics and branches of the more biologically rooted soft sciences like evolutionary psychology or neuropsychology. This has often been the subject of mockery by the other sciences who see this and have even demonstrated it numerous times. Knowing that such journals will publish anything as long it's presented in deconstructionist language, such journals have been the brunt of satire hoax publication. The most famous is perhaps the Sokal affair by Alan Sokal, where a physics professor at New York University and University College London in 1996 submitted an article to Social Text, an academic journal of cultural studies. The article, Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, was published in the journal's spring-summer issue in 1996 titled Science Wars. It proposed that quantum gravity is a social and linguistic construct, and proposed that quantum gravity has progressive political implications and that the morphogenetic field could be a valid theory of quantum gravity. Since the journal did not submit the article for outside expert review by physicists, it was published and allowed the pretense of scientific thought in an academic journal. This means other academics from other fields would regard it as a valid source for citing. And so a bogus theory could enter the system of academic rigor more readily through this exploit, and can be perpetuated by those trusting in the reputation of rigorous peer review for valid forms of information from disciplines outside their own, when writing their own academic research. This exemplifies how deconstructionism can be misused to circumvent the rigors of scientific and critical thought and promote ideas to the public as having academic legitimacy. It then happened again recently with James Lindsay and the Grievance Studies affair, a project that entailed submitting bogus papers to academic journals. They wrote on topics from the field of critical social theory such as cultural, queer, race, gender, fat, and sexuality studies. They did this to see if they could get them through peer review and be accepted for publication. Several of these papers were subsequently published. The academics Boghossian, Lindsay, and Pluckrose wrote 20 articles using deliberately outlandish and morally questionable ideas, and then submitted them to various peer-reviewed journals. 4 of their 20 papers had been published, 3 had been accepted but not yet published when the hoax was discovered, 6 had been rejected, and 7 were still under review. Among the articles that were published were arguments that dogs engage in rape culture, which had won special recognition from the journal that published it. Another on how men could reduce their transphobia by anally penetrating themselves with sex toys, and another using a chapter of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf rewritten in feminist language, explaining the need to take fascist actions in the feminist language of revolutionary action. This exploit of the peer review system of academia, using deconstructionist academic journals to publish research, grants prestige and weight to esoteric theories which then carry the backing of other intellectuals who cite them in their discipline, which allows those theories to gain traction in public discourse and legal policy, has a trickle-down effect on the lives of people who have no aptitude for comprehending or discussing esoteric theories generated in decadent academic circles, creating luxury beliefs which they become socialized into, ideas they cannot possibly afford to live out, but which they become the testing grounds for the long-term effects of. So the empirical test for things like gender theory ends up being its long-term effects on communities with no aptitude for metaphysical discussions and or devoid of pre-existing strong convictions on gender. For what I think is a documented example of this process happening, where a concept moves from cultural studies into soft science and from there becomes prescriptive, see my video on toxic masculinity, where concept of toxic masculinity developed by gender theory and feminism has permeated the academic literature in the last 10 years, unchecked, and is now becoming a concept in psychology and which is on the pathway to medicalization. That is to say, something with no biological pathology will be treated utilizing pathophysiology medicine. It bears mentioning here that the other discipline which has a severe replication crisis is medicine. Once a prospect like this, the medicalization of social constructs enters the domain of big pharma. The opportunity for cutting corners and doing rigorous research becomes incentivized significantly. So although the West found its way through the challenges of the Enlightenment radical skepticism, we find ourselves dealing with a new kind of skepticism developing about what is truth versus what is disguised power calling itself truth. Can our scientific methods still be trusted to attain it? And can we trust our institutions for distribution of it, like scientific journals? The Enlightenment skepticism can leave one's mind in something like the Matrix, where all reality might be nothing but a fabrication of stimulus on our neurons by machines while we exist as nothing but brains in vats. Yet those brains could still rely on mathematics to be non-material eternal truths. Even the robots needed math to build the computers that run the simulation. From math, then, we could rebuild our understanding of reality, but one which was reductionist. While the current epistemological crisis has left us in a radical skepticism of concepts like good and evil, male and female, and nature and culture, which could just be the products of Western hierarchical power and binaries of inclusion and exclusion, and not derived from any objective reality. This skepticism can leave one removing their genitalia and living life on hormone treatment, not a far-off condition from what the Matrix robots were doing to the human body while they farmed them as incels being pumped full of gruel. This model of ontology, where all reality is a grey, meaningless goo with no intrinsic objective content to know, leaves the world as an amorphous kind of substance to which social constructs give form and meaning to. Using the Matrix analogy, being the Matrix would be more real since it contains these social constructs. Outside it, there are no social constructs, at least none formed by humans, and so there is no reality to be found outside of it, just math and metal. Or to use Plato's analogy, the shadows are all that is real. The binary light only wants to oppress and dominate the shadows, and so man's freedom is in the creation of new shadows, making this epistemological crisis conjoined to a metaphysical one, in which the insufficiency to articulate the traditional metaphysical models, those of Aristotle, Plato, or even Heidegger and Kant, by the contemporary sciences through synthesis with those models, has enabled that absence of what's being said to be the only thing that we believe is there. If you can't articulate the metaphysics of gender synthetically with what is biologically demonstrated, then all that is there is a genderless, valueless, formless goo. In other words, our metaphysical model for understanding the world is increasing, becoming what's left when you have no metaphysical model to understand the world. The negation of a positive something is becoming the production of a positive nothing. This amorphous goo has only the quality of receptivity to our constructive social forms and is oddly akin to a medieval conception of prime matter, albeit a poor understanding by a materialist. This epistemological crisis has at least three parts. First, the deconstruction of all positive pre-existing forms in the world, such as gender, nature, and goodness, progressing towards an increasing attempt to decompose all scientifically formulated taxonomies, which give pre-existing forms in the world like species and distinctions between animals, plants, and humans. Since ultimately such taxonomies could lead to legitimizing ideas like race, this increasingly deconstructs the concept of nature itself, although unwitting is reconstructing a concept of nature as just more of this grey, formless goo. Second, it disrupts the legitimacy of academic certifications like peer-reviewed journals and flows into the academic fissures of knowledge, finding legitimacy by making claims of what cannot be disproven, such as the patriarchy, unconscious racism, or unconscious domination, where the existence of these things are proven by the very act of denying them. For example, if you deny systematic racism, that is evidence of systematic racism, or your denial of the patriarchy is a privilege that was enshrined to you by not experiencing being oppressed by the patriarchy, and so demonstrates your collusion with it. When we switch from highly specialized bodies of knowledge when doing a multidisciplinary examination of problems like human sexuality, there exist fissures for uncritical theories to fill in the gaps. All of this exposes many of the problems with academia and the peer review mechanism for putting checks on theories, for filtering out the true from the false, or establishing standards of critical rigor which test the mettle of ideas. Lastly, we are seeing a technological layer added to all these problems for knowledge accreditation, in the way that anyone can promote any idea in a social space and in a way that is becoming increasingly easy. This allows rogue elements with no academic training or accreditation to use tools like AI and make high-quality material for anyone who wants to listen. Ironically, this too is rather medieval, where before a university would have the students hire a teacher so that the student body chooses their professors. However, that professor needed to be certified by the Holy Roman Empire or Church. YouTube allows a similar process where a creator presents themselves and a body of interested learners support them, offered through Patron or similar sites. These rogue academics on YouTube do not go through any vetting process. They can be professional academics doing YouTube on the side, or any number of malicious actors working anonymously from behind a fake identity to spread weaponized information. I too benefit from this setup. I choose AI voices because it helps me rewrite my ideas, hear them out, and make continual revisions rather than speak from the cuff or try to get a perfect final take. I also just prefer the aesthetics of speaking in the voice of a stuffy old Englishman. It's a fitting persona for topics like this, and better than hearing my own plebeian accent. It also is becoming of dry wit, which I fancy myself as having an appreciation for, and befitting of deadpan punchlines and snobbery. So although I am a trained academic, cultured, multilingual, and well-read, to the listener there was no vetting. For all you know, I could be sitting in a tweed jacket naked with a monocle, reeking of whiskey, writing whatever bullock ideas that capture my fancy. There is not a physical classroom in an accredited university, ensuring that I have been sufficiently evaluated and tested, and where you can see I'm a real person. This too may be a good thing. It forces the listener to develop their own criteria for evaluating ideas instead of the institutional guarantee that everything said is true, making your education even more your own responsibility and not something that can be outsourced to an institution to decide for you. This also has many limits. A neophyte cannot be expected to know what curriculum they should follow, any more than a traveller to a new country should know what places to go see. What is important or historically significant when starting from a place of knowing absolutely nothing about it? Still, those skills will need to be developed by any lifelong student and utilised by the educated also. Regardless, there is a protective function offered by the university in expediting this process. Through trust in a curriculum, someone's critical thinking faculties can be developed enough that they can start recognizing bad science and bad argumentation, or arguments that will lead to conclusions not fit or acting upon or utilizable. However, if the university destroys its own credibility, it will be no better source for information than YouTube. A place where there may be great teachers, it will be up to the students to search them out, know how to recognize them, and protect themselves from dishonest instruction, all while in a state of naivete regarding what they should know. A paradoxical situation. In the next video, I will look at how this problem has been furthered by an existential crisis in the West, to have a sense of moral meaning combined with a sense of moral obligation on the part of the intellectual left to follow Herbert Marcuse's repressive tolerance. Then look at the project of Jordan Peterson to remake the university in a digital age.
Big black